welcome to my digital talk on the US election. This series of conversations on the presidential election in the United States is possible thanks to the support of the Austrian-American Partnership Fund, which promotes collaboration and exchange between Austrian and American non-governmental organizations, universities, and professional associations. I have a very special guest with me today, Richard Fontaine. Richard Fontaine is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. He served as president of the Center for a New American Security from 2012 to 2019, and as senior advisor and senior fellow in the period prior to that. Prior to the Center for a New American Security, he was also foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Fontaine served as foreign policy advisor to McCain 2008 presidential campaign, so he's certainly familiar with the US elections. And my first question for Richard is, as expected, dedicated to the possible election outcome. Now, if we look at the preliminary results, Joe Biden and Donald Trump remain neck and neck in the election race. So it's a very, very close race, so to say. Would you explain, please, a little bit about your expectations regarding the election outcome and what is really going on, because the European audience will certainly would like to know more about it.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an interesting time to be talking to you the morning after Election Day here in the United States, but before we know who the next president of the United States will be in this moment of limbo. And in the future, I look forward to being in Vienna with you rather than Zooming, but this is a good substitute. While in our system, a candidate needs 270 electoral votes to be elected president. Last time, Donald Trump got about 330 electoral votes. So even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, the Electoral College was not close at all. This time, the Electoral College looks like it will be very close. There are a number of states who haven't completed their counting of the votes, largely because there were so many mail-in ballots that were submitted because of coronavirus, and it's just taking them a while to count those ballots. There was an unprecedented number this year. So where things sit as of 10 a.m. here the morning after the election in Washington is that there are a couple of states that are really the key ones that are in play. So you've got Pennsylvania, which we knew all along would be very important, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada. Also, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona still need to return their results. But if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, which is where he's leading right now, and if Joe Biden wins Nevada, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where he's leading now, then that would put Joe Biden on top with exactly 270 electoral votes. So you couldn't have a closer election. It would be 270 to 269. So there's a few other possibilities, of course. The Michigan could slip from the Biden column into the Trump column. One of the ones where Trump is currently leading, like North Carolina, Georgia, or even Pennsylvania, could slip the other way. So there's a number of possibilities now, but it seemed, my analysis is that Joe Biden is in the stronger position to win the election than Donald Trump. But the big lesson here is we don't know. We just don't know how this is going to come out because of not only the uncertainty around where we are in each of these states, but also just the uncertainty about the counting of the remaining ballots and what this looks like. We also don't know when we're going to know. So Nevada, for example, said, don't worry, we will be back to you on Thursday with results. Well, today's Wednesday. And so, waiting 24 plus hours to find out more results feels a bit excruciating. But that's kind of where we are. The bigger point here is no matter who wins, and again, I think at this point, Joe Biden is likelier to win than Donald Trump, that president will face a very divided country. It looks like the House of Representatives will have a Democratic majority, the Senate will have a Republican majority, and the presidency will either be Joe Biden or Donald Trump. So you will have a divided government between the two parties in a very divided country, and that makes it hard to marshal national solutions to some of these big global problems and the kinds I know that we're going to talk about today.
The polarization that you've named due to the possible US election outcome has been, in fact, already in place during the Trump's administration, and probably will be accelerated to some extent following this election. But what is your expectation when it comes to the implications for the US foreign and security priorities and goals? We are right now in the middle of a great transformational phase where the United States is facing an increased, let's put it that way, Chinese activities everywhere in the world, but then again is also looking for credible and loyal partners and allies. So how do you think this US election outcome is going to impact the US foreign and security policy? And what would be your concrete expectations in terms of the future foreign and security policy agenda of the United States, depending on who is going to win, of course?
Yeah, so the depending on who's going to win is the important part of your question, because if you look at there's almost two separate issues. One is the divisions in the country, the political divisions, and what do those look like in terms of foreign policy outcomes. But the other is who wins, with the who wins being actually the more important part of this, simply because if you look at Donald Trump and Joe Biden's approaches to foreign policy, they really are very, very different in a lot of ways. I mean, there's some areas of similarity. They both would like to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. They both want to have, trade and other economic policies that will return manufacturing jobs to the United States. But once you get out of those kinds of areas of commonality, they're very different. Donald Trump doesn't make climate change a priority at all. Joe Biden puts climate change at the top or the very top. Donald Trump wanted to get out of the Iran nuclear deal. Joe Biden says he'll get back in. Donald Trump withdrew America from the World Health Organization and other international organizations. Joe Biden says he'll get back in. Donald Trump is not a big fan of American alliances and thinks that they sort of take advantage of the United States. Joe Biden says our allies are kind of our greatest strength and things like that. So depending on who's in there, you can see a very, very different set of priorities over the next 4 years. And of course, as we were just describing, we just don't know whose priorities are going to be followed. On the division part, however, there's some areas in which things just get harder. So, for example, in a divided government where it's hard, the government right now has not been able to come up with a second package of economic stimulus for coronavirus relief. Now, that's largely a domestic policy issue, but given the size of the American economy and everything that the United States does in the world, it has some significant foreign policy implications. And then I think they will have one after the election, but a divided government makes it harder to do it than one that's more unified. The other thing is the difference in threat perceptions. So right now we're in a kind of a strange situation where, the polling shows that Republicans put the threat of China much higher than Democrats, and Democrats put the threat of Russia much higher than Republicans, and so there's less consensus than one might like about how to rank foreign policy priorities and therefore what to do about those priorities in the world. And that makes it harder to generate domestic support for particular policy outcomes and so forth. The one thing that, and of course, that's also true on other issues like climate change, where Democrats say this is a very high priority, Republicans say it's a low priority, and so forth. The one area that everybody can agree on right now is that pandemic is, beating back the pandemic is the number one priority. But once you get below that, on all the other issues, whether it's terrorism, great power competition, meddling in democratic elections, trade policy, Iran, North Korea, you see cleavages between and within the parties. So what it means is that you need a very strong presidential vision about where to go on these and what to prioritize first, second, third, and so forth. And that then puts us right back into it depends on who's going to win.
Yeah, right. And obviously there is a kind of polarization also, as you pointed out, when it comes to the US foreign and security policy towards China and Russia. And there is an interesting quote, by the way, which I've read recently regarding information warfare, which we obviously faced during the COVID-19 crisis in Europe particularly. And that quote says, if Russia can be seen as a hurricane, China is the climate change. Now, I would like to focus on the climate change first and foremost, because if there is one major battlefield in a more rhetorical way, put in a more rhetorical way, this is going to be how to face China, in what way. And I would like to ask you concretely what your expectations are, how the US-China relations will be, will look like in the next years. Once again, as seen through the lens of two different administrations, do you think, for instance, that Biden's administration would actually use or, go back to the Obama's approach, or and if, how exactly this would look like? And the same goes for, Trump 2.0, right? Will a systemic decoupling, for instance, which I think is one of the most important systemic issues, continue?
Yeah, I don't think there's any going back to the pre-Trump approach to China, no matter who is elected president, whether it's Biden or Trump. I think the country has moved on, the world has moved on, and China's moved on. So for years throughout, the Bill Clinton, the George W. Bush, the Barack Obama administrations, the engagement policy with China was premised on the idea that through deep engagement with China economically, diplomatically, in terms of information and everything else, that China would see an increasing stake in the global order, become a more responsible actor, and possibly become a more liberal country at home in terms of its democratic practices and human rights and so forth. Of course, none of that has happened, and at home it's become more repressive than it used to be, not less, and internationally seems to want to have a more dominant role, including building alternative structures to existing elements of global order when those don't suit Chinese perceived interests. And so both Republicans and Democrats in Washington have gotten significantly more skeptical of Chinese behavior and intentions. And I don't think there's any return to the idea that sort of full engagement with China with maybe some hedging on the side is the way to go. And instead, what will replace that, whether it's Trump or Biden, is a long period of deep competition across various domains. And so you can see these in the military sphere, where increasingly the US military is being configured not to beat back, terrorist threats in the Middle East, although that's a important role, or to conduct large-scale nation-building opportunities in the Middle East, but rather to deter against Chinese military behavior in the Indo-Pacific, and if necessary, defeat it. On the economic side, I think the decoupling of the economies is not actually happening, not at a systemic level, but certainly in key areas it is as companies are rethinking their supply chains, as the U.S. government and other friendly governments are prodding their private sectors to diversify away from China for a whole variety of reasons. On the technology side, certainly there's greater walls going up on the American side and on the Chinese side as well, to some degree, that bifurcate the technology ecosystems of the United States and China. And then there's a competition for influence, political and geopolitical influence in the Indo-Pacific, but not exclusively, also in Europe and in Africa and even in Latin America. And I think what you're going to see is a period of long-term U.S.-China strategic competitions across all of these domains. The big question, and I think this is really just an unanswered one, is if you look at the Trump administration, there's really very few areas where they have sought U.S.-China cooperation. I mean, cooperating against the coronavirus should be the sort of natural area where, even despite our competition, we all have a common interest in seeing this coronavirus stop and not spread. Nobody has an interest in seeing infections continue to rise and all of this. And yet there's no U.S.-China cooperation at all on a vaccine or on preventative measures. If Joe Biden comes in, one of his big priorities will be climate change. And that is an area, at least theoretically, of U.S.-China cooperation. And so the question is it possible to carry off cooperation with China on some big areas like climate change, like on global health, maybe on nonproliferation, maybe on North Korea, while at the same time you're pretty fiercely competing with each other in all these other domains on diplomacy and military and technology and economics and Taiwan and everything else. And it's not clear to me that those things can be done simultaneously. But if Biden does win, that's going to be an early test of the overall strategic approach to China.
Obviously, if we witness new administration led by the Democrats candidate Joe Biden, one thing that we need to elaborate on is the future relation to Russia. So let me remind you that during the Obama administration, the relations with Russia were in fact improved within this so-called Russian reset approach. And if you remember also, we've witnessed this awkward situation when, the Russian foreign minister was given a red button with the wrong word for reset, which actually meant overload. And this, I think, is a pretty good, summary for what we would expect during this administration, where obviously, as you've pointed out, Russia is going to be priority number one to tackle among the foreign challenges, right? So what is your expectation that in terms of future US-Russia relations? And also, of course, given that Trump wins and obviously kind of a very slow approximation effort has failed, what would you expect in that matter if, for instance, Trump has to shape the relations with Russia in a second mandate?
Yeah, so the Trump administration was the third U.S. administration in a row to try to reset relations with Russia. I mean, the Obama administration, as you described, was the most obvious and conspicuous in this. But if you remember, George W. Bush met with Vladimir Putin and said he looked into his eyes and he got a sense of his soul. This is a man we can work with and all of this. And of course, U.S.-Russia relations were not very good in the Bush administration ultimately. The Obama administration formally reset relations and said, well, they were bad in the Bush administration, but let's start fresh and we'll make them good. Didn't work. The Trump administration came in and said, why can't we get along with Russia? They're an important country. We should be teaming up with them to knock the hell out of ISIS, all these other kinds of things. And that didn't work. I think it's extremely unlikely that whether it's Biden or Trump, anybody's going to try to reset relations with Russia again. I mean, it's 3 straight failures. Oh, by the way, with the same government in Moscow, even though the government's changed in the United States. And I think people in Washington, Republicans and Democrats, have learned some things over the years. And it's interesting to think of Russia as the hurricane and China as climate change. Russia is a declining power, but it does not follow that because it's a declining power in the sort of global power balances that it's less threatening to the United States or to its neighbors. In fact, I think the opposite is probably true. It has less skin in the game each year. It has less invested in the existing rules of the system. It has a higher tolerance for risk and can be more provocative when it comes to matters as different as Syria and Ukraine and sort of provoking NATO and meddling in governments and elections overseas. And so I think you're going to see really very frosty relations between the United States and Russia. The strange thing about the Trump administration is, if you only listen to the president's rhetoric, you would think that we get along great with Russia. You would think that the president is best friends with Vladimir Putin, that we're cooperating with Russia. And in fact, the Trump administration's policy toward Russia has been much harder, much tougher than the Obama administration's. The Trump administration provided forms of lethal aid to Ukraine that the Obama administration did not do. The Trump administration sanctioned the oligarchs in Russia in a way that the Obama administration did not. The Trump administration expelled Russian diplomats and closed down consulates in a way the Obama administration did not. The Trump administration attacked Russian mercenaries in Syria in a way that the Obama administration did not. You can sort of go down the list. It's been a very tough policy, but it's totally disjoined from the president's rhetoric and the Helsinki summit and all these things that sound like, everybody gets along really well. And so I think if there's a second Trump administration, you'll see a continuation probably of this disconnect between the warm rhetoric for Putin and all of this with really a much harder underlying policy. With a Biden administration, I think you'll still see a tough underlying policy, but you'll see rhetoric that is more in line with the underlying tough policy toward Russia. The big missing piece on some of this is on Russian political interference in other countries. And here we see a way that these issues are treated very differently than all the other kinds of things that Russia does. So when Russia invades Ukraine and takes Crimea, it sort of galvanizes the transatlantic partners. There's sanctions, there's a common response, this is a NATO issue, et cetera, et cetera. When the Russians will poison Skripal or someone in England, that's seen as an international issue that merits a common transatlantic response, and the Germans coordinate things. And even the poisoning of Navalny and things are sort of seen as international events, and they need a common response. When Russians have interfered with political systems for whatever reason, it's seen just as a unilateral thing, as a national problem, not a transatlantic one. And so, 2016, the Russians interfered in the U.S. election. Only the United States responded. The Russians interfered in the French elections. Only the French responded. And so we need to take as seriously the protection of our own democratic political systems as we do the territorial sanctity of NATO countries and, the protection of our own countries against, the poisoning of people on our soil and the territorial integrity of our neighbors and things like that. And that, I think, is the next phase of this, which is to coordinate efforts to protect our own democracies against Russian meddling, not just our own territories and friends.
Clearly, what you've pointed out leads me also to my personal conclusion about Russia, which I see as this disruptive power that none of the main competitors wants to see in the other blocks group, so to say, so in the other block, which means, of course, that it's not so much about aligning with Russia, but it's more about not letting others to align with Russia, because then it becomes a bigger problem. However, what you've just outlined leads me to also to the conclusion that given that the relations between United States and Russia will deteriorate, that would create a certain pressure on Moscow to ally with Beijing. Do you see this possibility for further systemic coordination between Beijing and Moscow in key fields and in key sectors, as being opposed to Washington and its allies and its partners? Do you see it as an emerging problem? Or do you think it's just a temporary phenomenon which will disappear once Moscow sees itself or its key geopolitical interests being threatened by Beijing? What is your take on that?
Yeah, my take on this has changed a little bit over the last couple of years, because I previously was fairly dismissive of the possibility of real coordination and cooperation between Moscow and Beijing, for all of the reasons that people generally cite for these things, that, Moscow would look like a junior partner to Beijing. They don't like that. There's still kind of regional tensions between them in Central Asia and competition and so forth. And that, sure, they can coordinate efforts to oppose what they believe is American dominance, either globally or in international organizations. They can veto measures at the UN Security Council. They can sort of team up to oppose the United States, but that it was hard and perhaps impossible for them to really articulate a positive agenda beyond just being a party of no. But I've actually changed my view on this to some degree, because I think the evidence is that they are coordinating and cooperating more. And you see this certainly in the economic field, sale of Russian gas and things like that. But also even in the military field, joint exercises in the South China Sea and then coordination in international organizations and some other things. And all of these are I think, relatively kind of minor events and things that on their own don't really do much. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese can do joint exercises in the South China Sea, but if the United States and China suddenly got in a dust up there, I don't think anybody believes the Russians would go, defend the Chinese. However, when you add it all up, it looks like the trajectory is of an increasing pattern of cooperation and coordination between China and Russia. And I think that's worrisome. It's particularly worrisome when it comes to technology cooperation and the ability of those two countries to intervene and meddle in democracies abroad. As we started off this conversation, a democracy like the United States has got enough problems on its own without having, other countries try to exploit our divisions and try to weaken the country. However, it's hard to know what one does about this. I mean, some of the solutions are often, in a world where there's three great powers, the United States, China, and Russia, it'd be better to be part of two than one, right? That's kind of easy to say, but it's not a clean block, for starters. There's not a China block and an American block and a Russian block. I mean, this is not the Cold War with just chess pieces on the board that one could move around at will. And then two, if we somehow pursued some great détente, entente, rapprochement, whatever French word you want to use from international relations to describe what we would try for with the Russians. What does that actually mean? I mean, maybe it could diffuse some of the outreach between Moscow to China, but what's the price of that? Is the price of that saying that Russia gets to enjoy a sphere of influence in its near abroad the United States won't object to? I think that price is pretty high. Will it, that NATO will, will pledge never to expand and ever again? I mean, I think, again, the price would be pretty high. So it's hard for me to see how you would ever have in Washington a U.S. government that would be willing to pay the price of what Russia believes it is deserved as, a global power. I think there fundamentally is a gap in the minds of Russian policymaking elites between the place they believe Russia should occupy in the world, its standing, its status, its influence, and the place they actually occupy in the world. And that's a real challenge.
Indeed. And speaking of troublesome relationships, if there was one particular relationship that was quite turbulent during Trump's administration, it was not related particularly to Washington's competitors or rivals, but was actually related to the closest allies on that side of the Atlantic. So I would like to ask you to touch upon the issue of the transatlantic relations, and how do you think the relationship between United States and Europe will look like, of course, once again, depending on the US election outcome, but also how in fact can this relationship be, or let's say get repaired, right? How can this relationship get better in such a short period of time? Because we definitely reached a low.
Yeah, I think that's well put. Here is where I think really the election matters a huge amount for two reasons. One is because Donald Trump and Joe Biden are so very different in their approaches to how they think about the transatlantic relationship and the alliances. I mean, I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Joe Biden was ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I worked for John McCain in the Senate when Joe Biden was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And his background is to really be a fierce believer in the importance of the transatlantic relationship, the institutions that unite the United States and Europe, and above all, the transatlantic alliances, NATO, and NATO's partnerships, and to see great value in those relationships. I think Donald Trump is probably the exact opposite, who came in and sort of said, why, wait, we're defending Europe? Explain to me again why, all these decades after World War II, the United States is still spending money to defend Europe against Russia? I mean, we have bases in Germany and troops. I mean, none of this makes a lot of sense. And the allies aren't, paying a lot for their defense. They're just getting rich, enjoying our protection and all this. It's just a fundamentally philosophical and therefore fundamentally different policy approach. So there, I think that really does matter. And I think if Donald Trump is reelected, you get probably more of the same. If Joe Biden is elected, then I think you get a much healthier transatlantic relationship. But then the challenge is, what does that actually amount to in terms of specific policies and actions that we're not seeing today with respect to Russia, China, other challenges in Europe's neighborhood, whether it's Belarus or the Sahel or Libya or the Levant and Syria and Lebanon and things. What does this actually look like? There's a second issue, though, and this one is a little bit harder to make out, but I think it's really there, which is, the number one question I've gotten for the last 4 years when I travel around internationally is how much of what our foreign friends see in the United States is about Donald Trump and how much of it is about America. And I think they're prepared to believe that, it's some of both. But the opposition to alliances, the sense of kind of America first, the notion that the United States has been taken advantage of by trade partners, by allies, by international organizations, by free riding people around the world, that's, there may be some underlying sort of basis for that, and some resonance for that, but that this was a big kind of Donald Trump thing. It's pretty hard to sustain that argument if he's reelected. And then it really does suggest this is what the American people want, or at least enough of the American people to get him reelected. Now, I don't believe that a lot of Americans, and in fact, it may be true that not a single American voted for Donald Trump because of his position on NATO or Germany and whether Germany pays 2% of GDP on defense spending or any of these other things. But I think nevertheless, it will be read as an affirmation of Trump's general impulses toward key international relationships. And of course, the transatlantic one is the first and foremost. And so, a lot rides on who gets 270 electoral votes.
And if there is one particular part of the world that is really, and it's not a secret, and it's really hoping for Joe Biden's win, that is to be found on that side of the Atlantic. All European capitals, almost all, probably with very few exceptions, are eagerly awaiting Biden's win. And like you pointed out, one missing component in the future of relations between Europe and United States will be predictability. That's been something that, has been missing in the relations for the last years, with the expectations for a change of the leadership due to upcoming elections, first in Germany next year and then in France the year after. It is, of course, a very difficult situation in terms of who is going to be also the next leadership in the main capitals that are going to shape the European integration, right? With having Brexit in mind, this is going to be even a tougher period for Europe. So that is why second Trump's mandate will be certainly very serious issue, how to tackle it, how to shape the relations, because all European leaders are quite worried about it, if that's going to be the case. Now, another, of course, issue which has, so to say, I think has unleashed a lot of controversy, and the views are quite opposite, is in terms of the future of the global order, right? Since we have still one particular country which has global power projection, has still the capabilities and the hard power to control maritime routes, supply chains, and to be deployed anywhere in the world. It is, of course, up to the future leadership of this country how the global order is going to be shaped. Now, of course, we are also in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution, whose outcome we don't know yet. And we know from the previous industrial revolution in the 70s that it was very decisive for the competition between United States and the Soviet Union. And right now we are having more or less, with minor exceptions, once again, two competitors, for riding the wave of the industrial revolution, of this technological revolution. How do you think this outcome will shape the future of the global order? What I have in mind, of course, is the discussion about multilateralism. I do think that Washington and the European capitals have one understanding about multilateralism as compared to countries such as Russia or China, which also talk about a polycentric world or multilateralism with Chinese characteristics. So what is your take on that? And do you think we are moving towards multipolarity, or is it rather bipolarity? What is also your take on that matter?
Yeah, so I think we're moving toward multipolarity, but not equal multipolarity. It's not the United States and Russia and China all as equal power centers, nor is it the United States and China on opposite sides with coherent blocks around them in some sort of G2 arrangement or bipolar competition or something like that. It's actually a lot messier than that for a couple of reasons. One, again, unlike the Cold War, you don't have coherent blocks. I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union could look during the Cold War and see more or less who was on their side, who was on the Eastern Bloc, who was on the free world bloc. And then, of course, there were the non-aligned countries that were sort of up for grabs, or countries that, were and then known as the third world, that would sort of, align with one side or then align with another and so forth. And there was a lot of competition for those, but, everybody knew which side Eastern Europe was on. Everybody knew which side China was on until China was on the other side. These were pretty coherent moves. And now most countries want a mixture of security and economic benefits from both the United States and China. And they are not going to just choose to align 100% with the United States against China or Russia, or 100% with China against the United States. Here, actually, I think that really benefits the United States and what we're trying to see obtain in the world. What I kind of refer to as the order of the order, the order of within world order, who's sort of on top and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, is America in decline and China's rising and all this stuff. And, we can debate that. But the reality is the United States still has by far the biggest and most powerful military in the world. The bases around the world aren't going anywhere. The universities and our innovation economy and our and the kind of capital markets that fund that aren't going anywhere. The alliances that we have all over the world aren't going anywhere. They could be healthier, but they're not going anywhere. Whereas China, for example, has North Korea and maybe Cambodia on a good day as its allies. And, Russia, well, I guess Russia has Belarus. You can tell me how valuable that is these days. But, it doesn't, it's a very asymmetric power profile that I think is going to endure for some amount of time. On the multilateralism side, I think what you're seeing, however, is what we did see to some degree during the Cold War, which is when you have these bodies where great power competitors are kind of at loggerheads, it just paralyzes them. So, I mean, there were decades during the Cold War when the UN Security Council just couldn't do much. Every now and then it would find a niche issue that it could do something, because the United States would be on one side and the Soviet Union would be on the other, and one would veto one thing and the other would veto the other thing. And we're back at that at the UN Security Council. So, we're at the, the biggest global pandemic in 100 years, and we reached the worst, kind of economic performance since the Great Depression. And yet the UN Security Council couldn't even put out a statement about coronavirus because the US and China couldn't agree on what that statement should say, including about the origins of the crisis. You see the same thing at the G20, where, as recently as after the global financial crisis, you had the G20 coordinating fiscal and monetary policy. And now the G20, it had a virtual summit. It issued this great statement about how everybody's going to cooperate, but it was totally abstract. There's not been a single time-bound specific commitment of action, and there's really nothing that's come out of that. Even the G7 has been the same thing for different reasons. It just hasn't been able to galvanize a lot of multilateral action. I think the future here of some of this is going to be both in existing and new structures, issue-based multilateral cooperation. So, in the most recent edition of Issue of Foreign Affairs, I have a little piece that I co-authored on the idea of a T12, a Tech 12 grouping, more or less like the G7, G8 kind of framework, but it would be among like-minded, advanced democratic technology powers that could harmonize their approaches to technology policy rather than just having kind of generalized, undifferentiated cooperation. Actually focus on an area in which there, in my mind, are insufficient multilateral opportunities for action, and build a pattern of cooperation around there. And I think these more tailored multilateral efforts are going to be probably will to some degree replace the more generalized groupings that include very different powers that are in competition with each other and find it very hard to come together in common cause against things. I mean, again, I'm not a big fan of analogies to the Cold War for the world we're in for a whole variety of reasons, but there's a few lessons that are interesting. And if you look at, when the US and the Soviet Union were, in such fierce competition, there were areas where they cooperated. I mean, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, polio, vaccinations and outbreaks, the civilian space cooperation in 1975-76, but it was pretty thin stuff. I mean, it was not an everyday kind of thing. It was niche things for some time limited amount of, and all of this. And, but the only ways that they were able to sort of come together was on very issue specific things that would allow the competitive side essentially to continue on unchanged.
Mm-hmm. So, do I understand it correctly that according to your expectations, there won't be the case in which the so-called middle powers, and we have many of them right now, and these middle powers are doing what right now? They are basically balancing between United States and China, while avoiding to take sides, as you pointed out. So basically trying to capitalize on the relations with both countries in various fields, or let's say in domains of common interest. Will we come to the point where these middle powers will be confronted with either or choice, where they have to take sides, where this kind of controversy within the key domains is going to be so great that they will have to take a clear position? Because you've also pointed out, it's also about democracy. It's also about a certain understanding of common values and common norms and common rules of the game. Will we face such situation, or do you think that it's just going to be a kind of a balanced world in which none of the actors will be actually inclined to, get involved into offensive, controversial, or military conflicts, and will try to somehow mitigate this kind of situation so that there is, like I call it, having the cake and eat it situation, so you can actually capitalize on all opportunities. Is it a world that we are going towards, or?
Yeah, so the middle powers will not be able to avoid making choices and just kind of keep their head down and keep on going. But they also are very unlikely to face a sort of an overarching strategic choice like was put to them during the Cold War, right? So European countries during the Cold War had to either be on the side of NATO, on the side of the Warsaw Pact, or neutral, right? I mean, had to choose. And that was a grand strategic choice about one's orientation. You could fudge it a little bit on the edges, kind of lean a little bit if you were neutral. But if you're in the Warsaw Pact, you ain't going to lean on one side. If you're in NATO, you're not going to lean to the other side, right? And that was a military sort of alignment, but it stretched across the politics, the diplomacy, the economics, the whole thing. So you don't see that now. And, it's not the case that anyone's going to Austria and saying you must be with the United States and against China on everything, or you must be with China or against the United States on everything. But it's issue by issue choices that are going to be forced on countries. I mean, take everybody's favorite issue of the last couple of years, Huawei. I mean, countries have to make a decision about whether to allow Huawei infrastructure as part of their 5G networks or not. The United States says you shouldn't. China says you should. Got to choose, right? On some of these values issues, it's less sort of forced to choose, but it's a pretty acute choice nevertheless. I mean, Hong Kong and Xinjiang, countries either say nothing, support, or oppose. Oh, okay, those are three choices, right? They could say nothing forever, but most countries are going to want to take some sort of stand on what is being alleged as genocide in Xinjiang and the trampling and extinction of democracy in Hong Kong. So it's pretty big stuff. Relations with Taiwan. Where does a middle power stand? Well, you've got to make some sort of choice. So some of these choices are avoidable, but not all of them. And again, they're issue by issue choices that are going to be forced on middle powers. And I think some are going to end up making some choices in one direction, others will make them another. I mean, Huawei is a great example of that. And it's going to be a competitive sort of spirit where, the great powers are competing for influence in middle powers on an issue by issue basis. And that may actually hand the middle powers a degree of increased sort of influence in the world, because they can take common positions among themselves to some degree, and they are kind of the ones that are going to be prime movers. Everybody knows what the U.S. position is going to be on Huawei, and everybody knows what the Chinese position is going to be on Huawei. Those are not actually terribly interesting. The interesting ones are the middle powers that are trying to kind of work their way toward answers on some of these tough issues.
It's interesting that you mentioned Huawei, because just a year ago, there wasn't a debate on Huawei in the European capitals. In fact, the majority of European governments were pretty clear on their interest of introducing Huawei 5G to Europe. And in fact, they were quite unconvinced about Washington's security warnings. And it was, in fact, China's handling of COVID-19 all these interesting activities that were launched in European capitals, with the assertive Chinese diplomacy, with certain actions towards creating a positive image, and so on and so forth, that rang actually an alarm, and created a completely new atmosphere. And right now, we moved from the readiness of having even a non-spy treaty with China in connection to Huawei, to actually excluding Huawei from the 5G connectivity in various capitals. I mean, take France, take Germany, take UK. So I think it's a very interesting case to observe as to how this polarization, this bifurcation of the global affairs along these two, completely different strategies by Washington and Beijing is going to, to develop in the future. But I'm seeing two questions coming from the audience, and I want to use the opportunity to ask them to you. The one is related to the election outcome, and more concretely to the Republican Party. So the question goes, do you think that the Republican Party which has unconditionally, been unconditionally endorsing every move of Trump. Will the Republican Party change its attitude towards Trump after the election? And I have another question, which is related to the Middle East. Do you think that the U.S. election outcome will change the U.S. approach to the Middle East, given that a peace deal was reached between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and there are some quite positive trends right now in the region?
Yeah, so the question about the future of the Republican Party is one that at least some of us think about all the time now, and it's a bit unclear where things go, in part because the Republican elected officials, which is the real muscle of the Republican Party, have been very pro-Trump because Trump wins elections and his support wins elections, even though privately a lot of them disagree pretty significantly with some of his policy positions, including on some of the issues we've been talking about today. Part of this will depend on whether Trump wins or loses. If Trump loses, then the election 4 years ago looks a bit more like a fluke, and like there's a way of establishing a constituency that can elect Republicans, including to the White House, that can run on other issues. If he wins, it looks different, because it looks like, my former boss, John McCain, ran on a very different kind of platform. He lost. Mitt Romney ran on a very different kind of platform. He lost. Trump ran on Trump's platform, and he'll have won twice. Even, however, if he wins, he'll be a lame duck, and he can't run again. And so the battle for the future of the Republican Party will begin, within months. It'll begin even sooner if he loses, but it'll begin within months if he wins. And there, I think you'll see various actors trying to sort of consolidate support for their vision of where the party should go and what it should stand for. And ultimately, it's going to be the voters who decide whether they want a Republican Party led by people who are more of the John McCain, internationalist bent, that believe in free trade, strong alliances, American exceptionalism and American leadership in the world, a very active American foreign policy, or they believe in a more Trumpian kind of transactional America first, kind of thing. And that's just not clear right now. It'll be battled out, both at a kind of intellectual level among the policy folks, but ultimately at a political level among the voters to see who they support. Then it's just kind of up for grabs. On the Middle East, I think certainly, actually, I would expect either administration to try to build on the recent normalization success in the Middle East. So now the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan have all announced normalization with Israel. There are other countries that could be in the next tier that are ripe for doing so, whether it's Oman or Qatar. The big prize is Saudi Arabia, but as long as King Salman is on the scene, I think that's not going to happen. And then if he departs the scene and Mohammed bin Salman has the ability to make his choice on this particular matter, I think the Saudis are very likely actually to normalize with Israel. But when you look around the Middle East, there's so few opportunities for a win in foreign policy. I mean, everything is a choice between, right now, is a choice between, a bad outcome and a worse outcome. If we stay in Iraq or we stay in Syria, it looks like this, but if we leave, it might look even worse, things like that. And so this is one of those rare areas where you can actually see some promise of progress. It's certainly not a panacea. It doesn't solve the Palestinian problems and all these other things, but it's a win, and it's a good win. And I think both administrations will try to build on that success.
Thank you. That was great answer, and gave us also a kind of a positive, positive signal a kind of a hope for the future. So with that, I would like to conclude that much is to happen. We are in the middle of great transformational changes, but like you've pointed out, also some things will remain. Whether we like it or not, we have to admit that some realities in global affairs are in place. And I really liked your comment that probably we should not stick to Cold War vocabulary because the times are different. There are many, many middle players, middle powers that have a saying in international relations. And it's about, I think, in the end, about credibility, about being a loyal, a trustworthy partner. We are about to find out once we have a clear US election outcome. Until then, I wish you much patience, and I hope that this is going to be over rather sooner than later, so that we can also focus on building up the relations between Europe and United States, but also moving on with hopefully a new era in the global affairs, one that is more positive and more optimistic. By saying that, thank you very much for taking the time to participate in my digital talk just a day after the US election. And I wish you much health, stay safe and sound during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I wish you much success in all your undertakings and projects.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here virtually, and I will look forward to keeping in touch once we know the outcome of the presidential election, hopefully once coronavirus starts to subside, and let's say next year in Vienna.
That sounds about right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.